Imagine your brother leaves home one morning. He says he is traveling to the next town. The journey should take 2 days. But 2 days pass, then 5, then 10. No message, no witnesses, no body. Today, his name could be entered into a national database. Police might examine security cameras, bank records, phone locations, or transportation logs. But this is ancient Rome. There are no photographs, no fingerprints, no telephones, and no official missing person system waiting to find him. So what would actually happen? Would Roman authorities organize a search? Could your family take his property? Could his wife remarry? And what if, several years later, he suddenly walked through the door? The answer depended on one extremely important question. What kind of missing person was he? To the Romans, disappearing was not a single legal condition. Your relative might be an ordinary absentee. He might have run away from debt, deserted the army, been kidnapped by pirates, escaped from slavery, or fallen into enemy hands. Each possibility created a completely different problem. And before anyone could bring him home, his family had to work out which explanation was most likely. Rome did have officials who handled public order. Soldiers sometimes performed policing duties, while governors and local magistrates could respond to petitions. But there was no centralized police force investigating every disappearance. No official would automatically begin searching simply because someone failed to come home. For an ordinary family, the first search party was usually the family itself. Relatives could question neighbors, contact business partners, visit inns, follow the missing person's intended route, and send letters to people in other towns. Wealthier Romans had larger networks of clients, freed people, and enslaved workers who could carry inquiries across long distances. A poor person possessed far fewer options. If nobody influential considered your disappearance important, you could simply vanish from the surviving record. But Romans did have something resembling a missing person notice, and some were surprisingly detailed. One notice preserved on papyrus from Roman Egypt describes a runaway man through an extraordinary list of characteristics. He was tall and thin. He was bald, with a scar on the left side of his head. He had a narrow jaw, a long nose, a thin beard, and no hair on his chin. He was a weaver who could not speak Greek. But the description did not stop with his appearance. The notice said that he spoke in a high-pitched voice and walked around like he's somebody. Apparently, even 2,000 years ago, excessive confidence was an identifying feature. Without photographs, Romans reconstructed a missing person from whatever observers might remember: scars, complexion, hairstyle, clothing, occupation, accent, language, posture, voice, and traveling companions. A scar was particularly useful because clothing and hairstyles could be changed. A familiar accent or distinctive walk was much harder to hide. Unfortunately, many surviving notices concern enslaved people. Their owners were not conducting humanitarian rescue missions. They were attempting to recover valuable human property. Rewards could encourage innkeepers, merchants, travelers, estate managers, and soldiers to watch strangers passing through their communities. Information might earn one payment, while physically capturing the fugitive could earn another. This effectively turned ordinary people into part-time bounty hunters. But it also created a dangerous question. How did a traveler prove that he was not a runaway slave? Romans did not normally carry standardized identity cards. A person's identity often rested upon recognition and testimony. At home, neighbors knew your parents, status, and occupation. Far from home, you might need companions, letters, or witnesses to confirm your story. That meant an unfamiliar traveler with no local connections was vulnerable. Being in the wrong place, wearing suspicious clothing, or resembling someone in a notice could be enough to attract attention. We know legitimate workers were sometimes caught in these searches. One inscription from Saponum in Italy records a dispute involving shepherds moving enormous herds between seasonal pastures. Local officials were detaining enslaved shepherds because they suspected them of being fugitives. The arrests disrupted the herds so badly that managers connected to the imperial household complained. The government's attempt to catch runaways was interfering with the emperor's own sheep. The officials were warned to stop harassing the shepherds without a proper reason. The episode reveals how unreliable identification could be. An enslaved person traveling as part of his assigned work might look almost identical to an enslaved person attempting to escape. There was another possibility. A missing slave might not be hiding at all. Some fled to a temple or took refuge beside a statue of the emperor. This placed the fugitive in a highly public location and transformed an escape into an accusation. During the reign of Antoninus Pius, authorities were instructed to investigate complaints from slaves who sought sanctuary because of severe mistreatment. If an owner's cruelty was established, the owner could be compelled to sell that person to someone else. So a Roman household might report a slave as missing, only to discover that the fugitive was deliberately waiting at an imperial statue for someone to hear the other side of the story. For a free Roman family, however, finding the missing person was only half the problem. The other half was deciding what to do with everything he left behind. Suppose the missing man owned a farm. Crops still needed to be planted. Debts still had to be collected. Taxes and obligations did not disappear simply because the owner did. Yet his relatives could not safely divide the farm as an inheritance while he might still be alive. Contrary to a popular assumption, classical Roman law did not provide a simple rule saying that every missing person was automatically declared dead after a fixed number of years. Long absence was not the same as proof of death. That could trap a family between two dangers. If they waited forever, useful property might deteriorate. If they treated the missing man as dead and he returned, they could face demands to restore what they had taken. And marriage was even more complicated. A missing spouse was not always a dead spouse. Roman jurists discussed cases in which a husband disappeared, reports of his death reached home, and his wife formed another relationship, only for the husband to return alive. The legal outcome could depend on what the wife genuinely knew, whether the report was believable, and whether she had acted in good faith. But there was one form of disappearance so common in Roman warfare that it developed its own remarkable rules: capture by the enemy. The moment a Roman citizen fell into enemy hands, his legal status changed catastrophically. From the Roman perspective, he had entered a condition resembling slavery. But if he escaped and crossed back into Roman-controlled territory, a principle called post liminium could restore his freedom and citizenship. It was almost as if the law had pressed pause on his Roman identity. His civic rights were considered suspended, not permanently severed. Upon returning, he could reclaim many of the rights he possessed before his capture. This produced an astonishing possibility. A man might return years later and discover that relatives had begun reorganizing property he still legally owned. But not everything automatically returned to normal. His marriage might not be waiting for him. In classical Roman law, marriage depended upon the continuing consent of the couple. Enemy captivity could end that marital relationship. If the captive returned, the couple might have to consent to being husband and wife again. The law could restore his citizenship, it could restore certain property rights, but it could not manufacture the feelings of two people whose lives had moved apart. Later Roman law developed different protections and waiting periods, but the underlying nightmare remained. How long should someone wait for a spouse who might never return? And what if the missing captive died before reaching Roman territory? That created another bizarre legal problem. If he died as a prisoner, he was technically no longer dying in the full legal condition of a free Roman citizen. That could threaten the validity of his will and disrupt his family's inheritance. Rome solved this using a legal fiction associated with the Lex Cornelia. The law pretended that the captive had died at the moment he was captured, when he was still legally a Roman citizen. Rome could not recover the missing man, so it moved the legal time of his death. This preserved arrangements that might otherwise have collapsed because he had died in captivity. Of course, most families never received such a definite answer. A merchant might vanish in a shipwreck. A traveler might die on an isolated road. A soldier's body might never be identified after a battle. No body meant no normal burial, but it did not always mean no memorial. Romans could construct a cenotaph, an empty tomb commemorating someone whose remains were elsewhere or unrecovered. The empty monument gave the missing dead a name and a place. Relatives could visit it, remember them, and make offerings, even though the grave contained no body. It was one way to end the waiting without truly solving the mystery, and perhaps that was the hardest part of going missing in ancient Rome. It was not simply that finding someone was difficult, it was that nobody knew exactly when to stop searching. A person might be dead, enslaved, hiding, imprisoned, traveling under another name, or slowly making the journey home. Until reliable news arrived, the missing Roman existed in two worlds: alive enough that his property could not safely be inherited, absent enough that his family had to continue without him, and possibly waiting to return to a home that no longer belonged to the life he remembered. So, how long would you have waited? 1 year? 5? Or would you build the empty tomb and accept that some Roman disappearances were never meant to be solved?